Why should you read the Dark Tower series by Stephen King? His epic fantasy western about a world that's moved on, with a gunslinger pursuing a man in black across the desert to try to find the Dark Tower for who knows what reason. Well, these are most of the books. There are 7 books. These are 5 of them plus something else, which I'll mention in a moment. The last 2 I've got lent out. The books are The Gunslinger, The Drawing of the Three, The Wastelands, Wisdom Glass, Wolves of the Calla, Song of Susanna, and The Dark Tower. There's an interquel, which I should say I haven't read, but I do own, The Wind Through the Keyhole. There is at least one novella, I think there might be 2. One, The Little Sisters of Illyria, which is in one of the Legends collections, which is good, which I do have upstairs, but I can be bothered to locate. So there's 7 main books, there's some other stuff in there. You don't need to read that. Technically, though, it also includes all of Stephen King's books, because The Dark Tower is the node, the central point of his entire literary universe. Everything is connected. You get particularly very strong connections to The Stand, to Salem's Lot, and there's a couple of others actually where you get characters from other stuff, from some of his other paranormal horror fantasies turning up in different places. Those tend to be less important, but yes, it's got a post-apocalyptic aesthetic. I like lots of responses to Tolkien by American authors in the 70s. You think of Robert Jordan and Terry Brooks particularly. It's part of that whole thing, by the way, along with Stephen Dodson, with Thomas Covenant, this whole response by American authors who've got Tolkien, from the late 60s onwards, who are really influenced by him and want to write their own epics. And this series, I think, has a claim in its own more limited way to be, for America, in a sense, what Lord of the Rings is for Britain. It's a mythology. It's a mythology of the gunslinger and of of the American melting pot. I don't mean of cultures, though there's a bit of that, but of people, of this pulling together of people, some of whom seem to be actually from America, as well as Roland, who is from a sort of Arthurian kingdom in a fantasy world, but is also a Western gunslinger. He's descended from King Arthur, seemingly, or an Arthur Eld, but he is also a gunslinger. The gunslingers are his Excalibur. So there's this sort of interesting, this connection of these old myths and fantasy and to a decaying world. We go to Topeka, we go, sometimes we'll step through a portal and see something like our America, or an America very much like it. There's lots of this sort of thing. There's lots of portals, there's lots of worlds, and this is it's got this very strong sort of it's not as detailed in the building. It's not as sort of thoroughgoing in terms of trying to create it. It's not a prehistory, say, to America or anything else, but it is in some sense kind of mythologizing America. It's the biggest things, though. I mean, I say that as a big thematic point, but the biggest stuff going on. You've got great characters, great world, great action, and in that sense, a great plot. I'll touch on the individual books in a moment, but just generally speaking, you have Roland's quest for the tower. You have the people he comes into contact with as he tries to get there, who he draws towards him. He's a natural leader. He's got lots of good qualities, even though he's actually quite solitary and burned by his experience of the decaying world behind him, both experiences before the fall of his homeland and since the fall of his homeland, since whatever's gone wrong with the world moving on. It's about that, and so it's about relationship, families, Roland's past family and his sort of engagement with other people who could be a family. But Roland is very, very damaged, and there's an echo to Thomas Covenant there. It's got very good gunplay. It's got very good fights. It has a very good laconic but stylized writing style. It's some of King's best prose I've read another 4 or 5 books of King's ever, so I'm not an expert, but it's amongst his best prose. It has its own diction. Characters pick up their own language, and sometimes literally they have their own language. But what I really mean is they have their own patois, their own style of speaking. It's got these very strong characters, not just Roland, but in the first book you also particularly meet a character called Jake, And there are some other major characters you meet through the series who I won't name here, you know, read it if you want to find out more, but reliably he creates arcs for these characters and they make sense and they work out and they do actually pay off. There's a controversy to address, which is basically the last 3 books. The first 4 books are, generally speaking, very popular, particularly the first 3. Book 4 has essentially a major digression. It has main plot, but it also has a major digression in it. But I think it's still generally considered very, very good. Books 5 didn't get a more mixed review. Book 5 actually gets decent reviews. Books 6 and 7 to different degrees get more mixed reviews, you know, more negative responses. They were written all at once. Basically, after he recovered from this car accident, he was hit by a car. He was like, I've got to write this. He recovered, he got his head together and was like, I'm going to write the rest of The Dark Tower before I die. Otherwise, I'll never write it. And it came out all at once. And there is a sense this is under the hammer. He's just got this stuff down and got it out. And it's funny because people complain about how King doesn't write any endings, but he does write an ending here. Controversial as to some people as some parts of the ending are. He writes an ending. I like the ending a lot. I actually quite like Book 7, The Dark Tower, even though it's not perfect. I like Wolves of the Calla. Book 6, Song of Susanna, I think the general opinion that it is slow and kind of odd. It's basically oddly paced and stuff happens in it. So it's not like, oh, what happens in it? But this, off the top of my head, I can only think of a couple of major things and you realise, this is like a 500, 600 page book that is just kind of getting between books 5 and 7. It's moving from, okay, the end of book 4 goes into book 5. Now we've got to have this next thing that's going to set up the end. The real big end run, which is the last 2 books. But really, you're still in a situation where book 6 is trying to set up final pieces on the board for book 7. And I think that basically that's obviously the point where he's just getting stuff down and it doesn't work quite as well. However, I think, so, you know, you could take the attitude, well, just read up to book 4, but read up to book 5, given that's generally well reviewed. I think it's worth pushing through to book 7. I never tell someone to go. It's not anywhere near as bad as what I hear of The Wheel of Time's The Slog. The Wheel of Time was enough of a slog for me that I read 4 books and gave up. But it's not as bad as people make that sound. Song of Susanna still has good moments, good stuff, and it's important, and you know it matters. So I think if you're in the kind of the run of reading it, then it's worth getting to the end. I mean, if you read the first couple and don't like them, don't read on. If you get to book 5 and you don't like book 5, you know, fair enough. But if you are enjoying it and if you want to find out the ending, there is a good programme to what is happening in book 7. It's a weird book in some ways. It has a lot of bold choices, and there's bold choices throughout the books. It's Stephen King at high creative kind of energy, but not on drugs. Well, at least in the back 3, he's not on drugs, and I guess maybe by a wizarding glass. But yeah, it's very fun. It has so many memorable things. Blame the Pain, Go Then, There Are Other Worlds Than These, Oi the Billy Bumbler, Lud, Susan Delgado, lots of memorable characters, memorable moments, the great way in which it blends, the Robert Browning poem Childe Harold to the Dark Tower came with, Childe Rowan to the Dark Tower came with Arthurian legend, with the Western gunslinger legend, with those kind of character dynamics of the American found family, but also with the kind of trauma of what happens in our pasts. There's lots of things, as I say, character, world, action / plot, which merge together often, are very good. Dullachuck, another very, very memorable moment. Just lots of stuff that you'll come away, just that will have imprinted itself on your mind. So I do recommend The Dark Tower, Septology. If you've read it, I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time.